Hi everyone, thanks for joining us here at the Packer and the Produce Market Guide for our deep dive on the 4th of July's impact on the produce industry. We've partnered with Riverson Produce to bring the managing partner from Execulytics and author of the Produce Almanac, Mike Mowdy, to present Red, White, and Boom. Over to you, Mike.
All right, thank you very much, Jesse, and thank you for Robertson Produce. So let's get right into Red, White, and Boom. And the big question here is, how important is the 4th of July for produce? And a side note, we're also going to talk about how important Canada Day is for produce as well, as those holidays do overlap. So we're going to set up a little bit of an infographic here to take a look at some very important parts of some metrics for the 4th of July. And as we set that up, we're going to get some good information. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is how important is produce shipments for the 4th of July. So if we think about how much of produce is actually shipped on the 4th of July, we take a look at this heat map and we see where it stops. It goes all the way up to 2.6%. Well, that doesn't sound like a real huge number, but that means that 2.6% of all produce is shipped in this 1 week. And of course, there are 52 weeks in the year. So if we were to take a look at the average week for produce shipments and compare that to the 4th of July, we would actually get an index of 134. That means that on the 4th of July week, there are 34% more produce shipments than an average week throughout the year. So that's actually pretty important. Now, if we were to take a look at something a little bit more concrete and actually look at the number of truckloads, we would see that there are 38,250 truckloads of produce running around the country trying to feed these starving customers. That's about 6,000 truckloads every single day in order to satisfy the demand for the 4th of July week. Pretty impressive. Now, we're also going to take a look at what happened last year during the 4th of July. And we've got a little inflation and deflation ticker to take a look at that. And so we start off with what costs did for that week. And we see that costs were down a little bit by about 0.3%. And retail prices were up a little bit, about 1.8%. So that means collectively, retailers were making a little bit more money last year than they did the year before. And all of this data put together says that the 4th of July is the first #1 most important shipping week of the year for produce. So there's a lot that goes into the 4th of July and a lot of different products that make it the most important week of the year. And we're going to take a look at some of those products. And some of them are the usual suspects, one that wouldn't surprise you, things like cherries and blueberries and watermelon and corn. And then there's a handful of other ones in there that might surprise you a little bit. At the end, we see eggplant and green peppers. Now, we're going to take a little closer look at those two and just see exactly why they make the list. So the first item we're going to take a look at are cherries. So we'll set up our infographic to make sure that we are taking a look at all the most pertinent information. And the first thing we're going to look at is, again, that heat chart to see just how important this week is. And it's climbing. 13.1% of all cherry shipments occur on the 4th of July week. That means about 1 in 8 cherries shipped throughout the year, occur on this week. Very, very important week. And now when we take a look at the index, we're actually going to take a look at how it indexes relative to all other 4th of July products. And since the 4th of July is important for all products, this makes it even a heightened importance. So we're going to take a look at cherries relative to all other items on the 4th of July. And you'll see that it actually breaks the chart. My chart goes up to 500 and it indexes at 509. So what that means is that cherries are more than 4 times more important on the 4th of July than the average 4th of July product. And so when we're looking at truckloads, we've got almost 2,000 truckloads of cherries shipping across the country on that 1 week alone. So let's take a look at what happened last year, and we see that the costs were actually up a little bit. while the retail prices were down about 3.6%. So collectively on cherries, retailers gave back a little bit of profit. So when you think about it, if the entire program was a little bit more profitable and the most important product was less profitable, then we can probably take a guess at what's going to happen with some of the other products. So we'll keep an eye on that as we go forward. So now, and this makes it, of course, the number one shipping week of the year for cherries. So now let's get out our crystal ball. Let's take a look at what happened to cherry costs over the last 10 years. Now we see here there's some ups and downs and some wild swings, and it looks like there's quite a bit of seasonal variability. But one thing that is interesting about cherries is you see a handful of spikes, maybe about 4 or 5 big spikes. Now we're talking about a 10-year time period here. So there are some of those years where there wasn't a spike. So that's interesting to watch for. And the other thing that's interesting, if we were to take a trend line and cut it right through this graph, we could get an idea of the long-term movement of costs over time. So let's take a look at that. Pretty flat. Now let's take the data away and just take a look at that line. You can see that that line is nearly straight. So over the last 10 years, what this tells us is that although there's been some significant fluctuations from year to year and from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, by and large, there has been very little movement over the long term on cherry costs. So let's put the data back in here. And it tells us actually that the average annual inflation for cherries is 0.17%. So it's really almost zero. It's almost a rounding error to say that that there's any inflation. So now we can take that inflation, however small it is, and map that over the seasonal variability in order to start to understand what might happen in 2019. So let's take a look. We're going to predict cherry costs for this season. So we see in week 25, costs are relatively high, and then they start to come down throughout the next several weeks. And if we were to take a look at the important week, which is week 26, we see it's in around that $40, and then it drops from there. So if you're looking to plan some over and above merchandising activity, there's an opportunity during week 26 after a big drop from the weeks before, and then it continues to slide down. Although I want to add a cautionary note here. There are many things that contribute to the final costing of product. Mostly it has to do with the interplay between supply and demand, but things like weather get involved, long-term consumer trends, and all sorts of other variables interplay in order to set that cost. Of course, long-term trends can tell us where those costs are going, but you should be very careful to make sure you take all pieces of information into account in order to make your plans. One thing I will say, long-term trends would not have predicted what happened to celery this year, because there was something else happening in the marketplace, namely some very significant demand that caused that product to spike, and long-term trends would not have predicted that. So we're going to see this graphic come up throughout this webinar. This is an alert, and we're talking about a lot of products that make the 4th of July or Canada Day weeks very important. But there are also a few other aspects of this week that we shouldn't forget. And an important one is apples. I mean, apples, actually, the 4th of July is one of the least important weeks for apples. Despite that, apples are the number 4 tonnage item behind seedless watermelon, potatoes, and onions. So although the 4th of July is not so important for apples, apples are very important for the 4th of July. But there are these other items that we're very concerned about, namely cherries, and we're going to see watermelon and corn and a whole bunch of other items, that it can sometimes be possible to forget about something as important as apples. And so you want to make sure that you keep your focus on apples throughout this time period due to its importance. So a few things that you can do to make sure that your company is staying on top of apples and making sure you're not leaving any sales on the table. Number one is know what your volumes are. Make a habit of keeping good records from year to year so that you understand where your sales are coming from and the actual amount of sales that you can anticipate from something like apples. Now, it's also important that you keep good notes when you're keeping those volume records, because if you're going to be short one year and you don't make a note of that, you might just duplicate that mistake the next year. So for apples, it's very important to know your volumes from year to year, simply because it's not going to be top of mind. The other thing, there are a lot of new varieties out there, and you can't carry them all, but this is a great time to try a new variety or two. This is a time when people are out there looking to spend a little bit of extra money, looking to expand their fruit purchases so that they can put together a nice spread for their company or whoever they're entertaining at that point in time. So trying a new variety might be a good play. And lastly, assign someone to maintain the apple display in order to minimize out of stocks. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to be the only thing that person's going to do throughout the week, but make sure that there is somebody who, as part of their responsibilities, is to maintain the apple display. So now we're going to take a look at another very important item for the July 4th weekend, is blueberries. And we're going to set up our infographics. So we're taking a look at all the same information. And the first thing we'll take a look at again is that heat chart to see just how important the 4th of July is for blueberries. I think it's going to stop. Oh, stop below where cherries were, 8.6%. So 8.6% of all blueberries are shipped for the 4th of July week. Now, what's important to note here is cherries are generally not a 52-week-year program, where blueberries are. So while cherries are concentrated on a smaller number of weeks, blueberries ship 52 weeks. So for 8.6% of them to be shipped in this 1 week, that's almost as impressive as 13% of the cherries being shipped in that 1 week. So what does this mean for index to all other July 4th products? Well, it still index is very high at 335. And so 100 is an average, is the average of all products. So indexing at 335, that's still very high. Now, there's not as much volume associated with blueberries as there are with cherries, but still 454 trucks across the country for this 1 week. And so what happened last year? We see that costs were down quite a bit, and retail prices are up quite a bit. So we gave it all back in cherries, and now we're starting to claw it back with blueberries. And so all of this information together makes July 4th the #1 shipping week for blueberries. So just like we did with cherries, we're going to take a look at the 10-year costing trends for blueberries. And this is every weekly cost between weeks 25 and 29. And now you see something a little bit different here than what we saw with cherries, where cherries was definitely an up, down, up, down, up, down. This is a little bit different. It starts up, then it comes down, and then it goes back up again. So you still see some seasonal variability, but you see a little bit more longer-term trends. And if we take a look at the inflation, we see it's still pretty low, a little bit higher than what we saw in cherries, but still pretty low at 0.44%. And again, if we were to take that average annual inflation and map that over the variability that we see from season to season, we can take a look at the costs for this year. Pretty stable. You see it starts week 25 at around 16 and a quarter, a little bit higher than that, and pretty stable over the next several weeks, with the big week being at a prediction of 16.31, and then a spike up at the end of this time period for week 29. So again, if you're looking to put any over and above merchandising plans for blueberries, it looks like you could be in some pretty good shape. So here's a big one. I'm sure everybody has bought a watermelon or two during this time period. So we'll set up our infographic, and we're going to take a look again at how important the 4th of July is for watermelons, and take a look, see if it's more important than blueberries or not. And oh, it's pretty close. 8.3% of all watermelons are shipped on the 4th of July. And that is an enormous amount of watermelons, indexing at 323 to all July 4th products. And look at this. Look at how many trucks are going around the country shipping watermelon during this week. 6,244. That's, if you forget about the Sunday shipping, we're looking at over 1,000 trucks a day of watermelon. That's an enormous amount of volume. Take a look at what happened last year. Again, we see costs are down, and we see retail prices were up. So retailers were still trying to recoup from the losses on the cherries. So that makes sense. They use cherries as their loss leader in order to drive in the customers, and then claw it all back with some of these other items. And not surprising, July 4th again, the #1 week for shipping watermelons. So we're going to take a look at the price per pound of seedless 45 count watermelons. And again, we see a little bit of seasonal variability, but it looks like a little bit more of an upward trend in cost. And if we take a look at the inflation, we see it's approaching 2% average annual inflation. So now we're talking about something that is a little bit more significant, something where we can see that costs are actually rising over time. So if we take that inflation, again, overlay it over the seasonal variability, and we can come up with our projections for 2019. And again, pretty stable, pretty much peaking during that week 26, where there's going to be all that significant volume. But then there's still going to be a lot of volume of watermelons around, but the demand is going to tail off a little bit, and that's when you'll start to see some of those costs dipping down and basically just a hair below 20 cents a pound. So good opportunities to drive some good tonnage on watermelons. Now, what would a long weekend be, or a 4th of July week be without corn? I can think about all the corn displays in the stores right now with all the ears being torn back. So we'll talk about that in a second. So let's take a look at how important corn is. As we look at that heat map, go up, 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 up. 7.2% of all corn shipped is shipped on the 4th of July. Probably still not a big surprise. Still a big index, 280 compared to all other products in the department that week. Almost 2,000 truckloads. That's a lot of corn going across the country. And what did we see over the last year? Some big declines in cost, and declines in price, but not as big as the declines in cost. So again, clawing back a little bit of that profitability. And lo and behold, 4th of July is the #1 week for shipping corn. So now let's take a look at the cost over the last 10 years. This one's a bit of a different chart. Again, some variability. It looks like a bit of a lag in the middle years. But if we take a look at where the trends are, not as impactful as watermelon, but still a significant, about 1 1/3% annually on inflation. Map that over top the seasonal variability, and we get our predictions. So we see the time period starts a little bit lower, and then after the long weekend, we start to see some cost increase. So taking a look at week 26, good opportunity to drive a lot of corn tonnage. Now, I talked about some of the displays on corn and how I can picture a lot of the ears pulled back and a bit of a mess. Corn is actually a very big shrink item for any long weekend or particularly the 4th of July week. But it's not the only big shrink item. Another big shrink item that we have to be very careful with are strawberries. The volume on strawberries is still very big for the 4th of July, but it's starting to wane quite a bit. The big shipping weeks for strawberries are just prior to the 4th of July. And in fact, we see about 9 weeks where volumes decline before the 4th of July. That doesn't mean strawberries aren't a big seller. There's still significant volume. But there's a bit of a perfect storm with strawberries. Not only is it getting very hot, particularly in the stores, but volume is big, and sometimes the the focus is on other products. The focus is on the cherries and the blueberries and the watermelon and the corn. And strawberries can sometimes take a bit of a backseat. And if they do that, they can really hurt you on that shrink line. So it's very important to deal with strawberries with a bit of a sense of urgency. And so a few tips on what you can do to manage your strawberry shrink. Similar to what we heard with apples, understand what your volumes are. You're going to be seeing that the volume of strawberries are declining week after week after week as some of these other items get a little bit more prominent in the produce department. And if you're always bringing in what you sold the week before, you could always be chasing that volume and always be trying to get rid of that volume. So know where your volumes are going to be week to week. Secondly, try and replenish from the cooler as often as you can, trying to minimize that time on the real warm sales floor. Similar to that idea is try and use refrigerated displays wherever possible. Sometimes they can be at a bit of a premium, but strawberries are probably that item that should be using that premium display space. And again, we heard this with apples, but assign someone to maintain the strawberry display in order to be there frequently calling the product, making sure that some of the wet leaky berries are not on display. And again, that's not the only thing that person needs to do, but it could be one of the tasks that somebody is responsible for throughout the week. So now we're going to take a look at cantaloupes. We took a look at the other big melon, watermelons. Let's see how cantaloupes compare during this important shipping week of the year. So we'll set up our infographic and then take a look at our heat thermometer here to see how important cantaloupes are. We start to see these dipping a little bit. Now we're at 5.5%. So 5.5% of all cantaloupes are shipped during the 4th of July week, which is still a pretty big number. And if we compare that to all other produce items, we see that it indexes at 211, which means it's just a little bit more than twice as important during the 4th of July than all other 4th of July items. So a big bulky item, lots of trucks on the road. Over 1,800 trucks shipping during this week. So lots of traffic. Now look at this. If we take a look at the cost and the retail pricing, we see some very significant declines. So this is overlapping a time period where there was some significant food safety issues with cantaloupes. So a bit of an industry in flux at that time. So we see some major fluctuations in the costs and retails. And this isn't the number one week for cantaloupes, or at least it wasn't last year, but it's still a very important week, the third biggest week for shipping cantaloupes. So if we take a look at the costs, we see something that looks very regular here. We see a lot of ups and downs and some seasonal variability. And if we were to draw a line through the inflation, we actually see the inflation is fairly significant, 2.48%. So the chart doesn't really show that a lot, but we do see that there is some inflation, and it could be because that spike the year before last brought that inflation number up. So if we were then to take that inflation, overlay it across the seasonal variability, we can get again that cost for 2019. And what we see here is costs are very stable throughout this time period, but we do see a bit of a dip a couple weeks after the July 4th week. And if we take a look at the important week here, week 26, it's actually the highest cost week on the chart, but again, very stable, just a little bit over $1 separating all of these weeks. So now we're going to take a look at soft fruit. We're going to take a look at peaches, nectarines, and plums as a whole. Again, we set up our infographic in order to take a look at some of this very important information. And the first thing we take a look at is how important the 4th of July is for soft fruit. And we see that it's right at 5.2%. Now, I did all of these items together. As it turns out, peaches, nectarines, and plums all have approximately that same level of importance across the week. And if we take a look at how it indexes, 201. So it's almost bang on to twice the importance during the 4th of July relative to all other products. And we see 667 truckloads. So not as big as some of the other ones that we were looking at, a little bit closer to that blueberry number, but still a lot of truckloads running around the country. If we take a look at what happened over last year, we see costs are down about 9%, and retail prices were down about 4.5%. So a little bit closer matched cost and retail price deflation, but we still see the retail prices are down less than the cost is down. So again, a little bit more money being put on that gross margin line. Now, there are some other weeks that are more important to soft fruit than this week, but it's still a hefty 8th most important shipping week. So if we take a look at the costs, this is actually, we're just taking a look at peaches for the costing on soft fruit, and we see something a little bit different than what we've seen in the other ones. There's a definite upswing on costs throughout the entire time period. If we were to draw that line to take a look at where our inflation stands, at 5.39%. So every year, peaches are increasing in cost approximately 5%. So whatever you bought them for 10 years ago is going to be a lot less than what you can buy them for now. You can pretty much guarantee that. And there aren't a whole lot of items in the produce department that you can say that about, but peaches are definitely one of them. So now if we take that inflation, and again, put that over top the seasonal variability, we can take a prediction on where we're going to be in 2019. So here we have the first 4 weeks of this time period, very stable in around that $18 mark, and then at the end of that time period, it spikes up to over $22.50. So a good opportunity to plan some over and above merchandising right around that July 4th week. So good timing for that. And that also extends beyond that for a couple of weeks. So now I'm sure the one everyone was waiting for, eggplant. People are probably wondering, why is eggplant on this list? Well, it's actually a very good grilling item. So a lot of people will actually like to try eggplant probably for the first time, or make it one of the few times that they'll actually purchase eggplant and use it as a grilling item. So if we take a look at how important eggplant or the 4th of July is for eggplant, we'll see it goes up, not as much as some of the other ones, but it stops at 3.9%. So again, not as important as some of the big fruit products for that time period, but as far as vegetables go, it's a pretty important item. And relative to all items in the produce department for July 4th, it indexes at 151. So it still has a fairly heightened importance. Now, it not being as big of a volume item as some of those big fruit items, there's only 71 truckloads, but that's a lot of eggplant, 71 truckloads of eggplant. And if you take a look at where we were last year, costs were down quite a bit, and retail prices were down just a little bit. So we continue this theme of putting more money in the bank, always trying to recoup those losses for cherries. And if you remember right back from the beginning, the discrepancy between costs and retail wasn't that big. So there really was a significant part that had to be recouped from cherries. And this is the 6th biggest shipping week for eggplant. I'm sure everybody is on the edge of their seat wondering where the eggplant costs are going to be for 2019. And we take a look at the historical costing, and this is very regular. This time you see about 10 spikes. So every single year it goes up and comes down, goes up and comes down, goes up and comes down. So very, very regular. And if you were to draw your inflation line through it, you see it's about 2.25%. So there's some significant inflation. And then using both of those pieces of information to try and predict the costs, we get something that is fairly regular. Starts around 13, dips a little bit, and then goes up again. So, eggplant not being a very price-sensitive product, it's probably a good opportunity to drive some incremental sales by doing some over and above merchandising on a product that people are looking to try for perhaps the first time. And you see the important week 26, that's the costing you can hope for. All right, so the last item we have for you are green peppers, another important vegetable item. We'll set up our infographic and wonder to ourselves, how high on that bar is this going to go? So as it marches up, we see it stops at 3.8%. So 3.8% of all green peppers are shipped during the July 4th week. And what does that mean? That means that it has an index of 147. So we've been looking at some really big items: blueberries, watermelon, corn, cherries. These items are still very important. They are 47% more important this week than the average July 4th product. So it's still a very heightened importance. And we see 362 trucks of green peppers running around the country trying to satisfy that demand. In terms of our costs, we see costs took a pretty significant down drop of 27%, and retail prices were also down 13%. So this is the last item, and what we saw was every single item other than cherries costing went down more than retail price, or cost went down, retail price went up. So every single item was trying to recoup the margin loss from the cherries. I find that very interesting. So this is the second most important shipping week for green peppers. Again, it's another grilling item, a lot of salads. So a very important, entertaining item, and the number 2 week for green peppers. One last time, we're going to take a look at some costing. We see again some significant seasonal variability. Looks like a big uptick in the cost. We draw our inflation line, and we see 2.5% annual inflation for green peppers. And we use those pieces of information, again, to predict where we're going to be on the cost. And we see starting high, dropping for the week after the July 4th and Canada Day weeks, and then it increases for after that. Again, not a huge variability in cost, so something that you can easily put some over and above merchandising on. So our last alert before the end of the presentation, we're going to take a look at tomatoes. So tomatoes are a staple, of course. They have importance across the entire year, many different uses for tomatoes and in many different dishes. But we can't forget about them on July 4th. They are as important on July 4th as they are on any other week of the year. But what's important about this July 4th is, and adds a little bit of complexity to this season, is this is the first year post the end of the suspension agreement. So this is going to make things a little bit touchy when it comes to tomatoes, and potentially an opportunity to lose a little bit of profitability. So things that you might want to take a look at in order to mitigate against that profitability loss. Number one, know your costs. There could be some unexpected year-over-year inflation. Of course, we're going to expect a little bit of inflation on Mexican tomatoes, but there might even be some inflation on domestic tomatoes as that entire market increases. The other thing, understand what your competitors are doing with retails. There could be an unexpected shift in the marketplace that you're not aware of, and that could either make you out of line in the market, or it could ensure you're leaving profitability on the table. So know where you are relative to your competition with retail pricing. And then lastly, try and focus your merchandising as much as possible on domestic supply. It'll probably be a little bit safer in order to maintain those margins. So that's what we have for you today. Thank you very much. Have a happy 4th of July, and most importantly, best of luck with your produce sales. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you soon. That's it.